Welcome to the Cow's Opinion, the only show on where I give you the opinion, the Cow's opinion, on the latest and greatest and biggest video game news. And a lot of stuff has been happening in that FTC hearing with Microsoft. In fact, so much that we can go through it, and it's fascinating to watch. Don't worry about that Let's Play right there. But as you know, the FTC and Microsoft wrapped up their 5 days in court in San Francisco. And the FTC wants to stop the deal, but a lot of information came out. Not just about games, everything about Microsoft. What it wanted, how it does other things, how much money it makes us. This doesn't happen very often, you guys, so we really need to look at it. Now, the FTC originally wanted to bring the case before an administrative law judge in August, but sought to seek a preliminary injunction, become worried that Microsoft would try to close, even though some jurisdictions have not cleared the purchase. The problem is that only the UK has not cleared the purchase. They've said no, which means that Microsoft should just keep Activision Blizzard out of the UK and make the purchase. In the United States, it's a lot harder to break up a merger than it is to stop one. The FTC would have very much of a difficult time doing it. So, here are a ton. Look at all these facts that we're going to go through, guys. There's a lot of stuff. So, first of all, mobile. Microsoft really wants mobile, and that's part of the reason why they bought Activision. It was very imperative to us, if we were going to remain relevant and grow relevance in the market, we were going to have to find mobile customers for Xbox, says the CEO. Now, mobile gaming is growing faster than PC or console. PC and console are also growing, it's just that mobile gaming is growing faster right now. And Microsoft executives keep saying that they have not made a lot of progress, and they haven't. Nintendo and Sony also have not made a ton of progress. The very big players, the developers who make the hardware, have not had a ton of luck in mobile, so they're just acquiring new companies. Microsoft also considered other companies, including Zynga for Farmville, Pokemon Go's developer Niantic, and the Japanese digital entertainment mainstay Sega Sammy and Square Enix. These last two almost certainly are not going to happen. Japanese legal and governmental dealings do not really allow foreign companies to own Japanese companies. Speaking of Japan, though, while Xbox consoles have a respectable market share in the US, they're not popular in Japan. A 2019 analysis produced for the possible Square Enix bid said that acquiring Square Enix would provide gaming with market relevance in a region that currently lacks a meaningful Xbox presence, allowing us to reach more gamers and more geographies. This is both because of Sony paying developers in Japan to keep off of Xbox, so they don't have as much Japanese appeal, and also because Xbox just doesn't make a lot of RPGs and other stuff. But again, that would be difficult because the Japanese government is not really interested in having an American company own a Japanese company. Speaking of Sony, you see how I keep going into these segues? Sony paid game developers to discourage them from shipping games like Ghostwire Tokyo and Deathloop, which is why Microsoft had a hard time getting these games. Microsoft pays its own fees, and Spencer said that buying Activision Blizzard would mean Microsoft wouldn't have to spend as much on incentives, which is right. If you own the company, you can choose to keep it exclusive or not exclusive, of course, but it also means that you don't have to pay incentives to get big games if you own the publisher. Many games under consideration. This is an important part. One of the more dramatic moments in the 5 days of hearing was when the FTC lead lawyer James Weingarten sought to push Spencer to make certain comments on Microsoft's part. He got Spencer to say we're not putting any future Call of Duty game from PlayStation, which is keeping what they've said for months, but then he went further, asking him to do the same with all Activision content. Spencer did not immediately agree, which, you don't want to accidentally perjure yourself in court. I don't think they've even decided. But they're probably leaning towards more exclusive than not because exclusivity sells consoles. Activision publishes many other games besides Call of Duty, such as Diablo and Overwatch, but the bulk of attention has been on Call of Duty. It's the big moneymaker right now. Jim Ryan, who is the CEO of Sony, wasn't happy with a Microsoft-generated list of Activision Blizzard games that would remain accessible on the PlayStation. Overwatch is there, but Overwatch 2 is not, which is the current version of the game. We also learned a lot more about their long-range ambitions because the FTC got a hold of documents from Microsoft CEO Nadella, who got sent to top executives and board members to lay out their goals for the decade. This is huge long-term planning that you almost never get unless you're involved highly in the company. And Nadella is aiming for Microsoft to generate $500 billion by 2030, 10% year-over-year revenue growth. One document says the business could reach $100 billion in revenue by the 2030 fiscal year, where the company wants its Teams communication app to reach 1 billion monthly active users by then. Now that's $100 billion revenues only for the security, compliance, identity, and management. One fraction of Microsoft's business could be generating $100 billion in revenue. Now, that's before taxes, you pay your bills, and whatnot. It's still $100 billion. Just one department of Microsoft could be a fifth of the way where they want to be. Now, Spencer has said during testimony that Sony did not want to send Microsoft development kits for the PS5 before release, which means that Microsoft couldn't optimize Minecraft for current consoles, and that puts the game at a disadvantage on Sony consoles, and also hurts Sony. Because now when people want to play Minecraft, they're going to play it on their Nintendo, their Xbox, or their PC. Ryan from Sony, however, had a decent reason for that. The commercial risks associated with this knowledge of these features sets leaking to a principal competitor is not something we would choose to rely on any contract to enforce. Which is, a reasonable argument. Sony can either give them access and hope that Microsoft doesn't get the information too soon, or they can not give them access but realize that, hey, now the multi-platform games that Microsoft's going to make, they're not going to look very good on PS5, and that's not good for PS5. Now, Amy Hood, which is Microsoft's finance chief, told us in written testimony, she did not appear, she just written testimony, that she provides final approval for proposed deals, but Microsoft must sign off on deals valued above $500 million, which definitely means that Xbox had to have permission from Big Daddy to buy Activision Blizzard. Microsoft has $104 billion in cash and cash equivalents at the end of March of this year, so it's probably gone up, and 2022 revenue last year exceeded $204 billion. That $500 billion in revenue doesn't look as far away as you think when you realize that one of the departments has a good shot at making $100 billion in 2030. They already made $204 billion, which means they're more than 60% of the way towards their goal, with 6.5 years remaining. This is big boy moves. Now, Microsoft was determined to ensure that Activision's Call of Duty remained on Xbox when it debuted. The current generation debuted in 2020. Bobby Kotick conveyed that if Microsoft refused to provide a more favorable revenue share than the usual 70-30 split, the game would not continue to be available. From an executive. An FTC lawyer accidentally mentioned that Microsoft agreed to accept 20 instead of the usual. Call of Duty has so much pricing power that not only does it make a ton of money, Activision Blizzard gets to keep more of the money. Because they can just say, well, we're not going to make it for Xbox. We're not going to make it for PC. Well, not PC, but we're not going to make it for Xbox and PlayStation if you don't give us more money. We also had some altered expectations from Sony. This was interesting. Because early last year, 2 days after they announced buying Activision Blizzard, Ryan writes to another Sony Group executive that he was pretty sure Call of Duty would be available on PlayStation consoles for many years to come. This is against what Sony's been saying publicly now. But then he appeared to lose confidence in that belief. He had significant concerns as to whether Call of Duty and other Activision Blizzard games would be available on PlayStation after transaction. Because, yeah, if you don't put it on Sony, that's a lot of revenue lost, but you are encouraging that crowd to buy Xbox. Now, Kotick has been in video games for decades, but he fumbled when he saw the Nintendo Switch and said it would not be successful. because he had been more impressed with the earlier Wii. The Switch is now the third best-selling console of all time. And an FTC lawyer asked Kotick if Activision Blizzard would produce a Call of Duty game for future Nintendo. He said, and I quote, "We missed out on the opportunity for the past generation of Switch. So I would like to think we would be able to do that, but we'd have to look." They have no ability to make the stuff. It's been made for much bigger, more powerful consoles now. They have no way of figuring out how to also get it on Nintendo Switch. Kotick also made it clear that while Activision Blizzard has experimented with putting games in subscription libraries, he doesn't think it's sustainable long term. He considered putting games on Game Pass in 2020 during negotiations over the more recent licensing agreement, but decided not to and couldn't imagine anyone offering commercial terms that would be favorable. For a massive publisher like Activision Blizzard, long term, they're going to make a ton more money on their games than the short term but huge payment up front that a Game Pass will give you. Now, Weingarten has pointed out that while Microsoft agreed to provide Call of Duty to small gaming cloud players, such as Boostoroid and Ubertis, neither of which I've never heard of in my life, it didn't do the same with Amazon, which has the Luna cloud service. Amazon is also a prominent competitor in the cloud computing business. But speaking of clouds, it's kind of a flop because while Microsoft sought to supplement their PC and gaming consoles with a cloud-based streaming, along with a lot... They sought to do this. They wanted to give you a clouding thing too, and they began testing it in 2019. But gamers mainly use the cloud option not with their phones but with consoles while they wait for downloads to finish. At that point, they only play locally. It's been a long day, guys. The cloud gaming option is not growing and is unprofitable, says the finance chief for Xbox division during his testimony. The feedback today is that it's just not good enough definitely as a substitute to any of the current platforms. It can break through at some point on something new, but it's not happened yet, both on the economic and the content size. Now, remember, cloud gaming is a thing that kept the UK regulatory authority from approving the merger because Microsoft is currently the leader in cloud content and Amazon's a second. Sony and Nintendo have no cloud presence. They just can't do it. They're not built for it. But just because they're the leader doesn't mean it's anywhere near viable yet. So big picture memos from CEO Nadella of Microsoft for the various businesses scale across Microsoft is one is more important than the others for the company's investors because it's the earnings report after revenue, and earnings is the growth of Azure public cloud because the software maker doesn't disclose Azure revenue in dollars. One of Nadella's memos said that their infrastructure last year was $34 billion. The tally is very close to estimates from a research analyst who also says Microsoft is a buy. Cha-ching! Another document that became publicly available as part of the hearing identified 4 security companies that Microsoft uses to help. Microsoft is so big you can't have a security count. You need 4. And the results contribute to a scorecard to assess performance among their top executives. Metrics include the percentage of the accounts managed with at least one Okta, the percentage of commercial Windows 10 and 11 that have CrowdStrike, the mail recipients protected by Proofpoint, and commercial Windows that have Symantec. So that's big on its own, that Microsoft is so huge, they're using 4 different security companies to guarantee everything. And exclusive exploration is probably the most important one. And that was a lot of information, you guys. Microsoft has argued that it would keep Call of Duty on PlayStation and make games in that franchise available on multiple cloud streaming services for 1 decade. The acquisition strategic rationale and financial valuation are both aligned toward making Activision games more widely available, not less, says Hood. But on the last day of hearing, the FTC got witnesses to show that Microsoft did evaluate ways to reduce the availability of Activision Blizzard content. Stewart confirmed in prep for a Microsoft board meeting, executives examined a scenario of lower sales of Activision Blizzard games on PlayStation and ways of making up for the shortfall with more consoles and Game Pass subscriptions. So that is, now I think Call of Duty, if this goes through, will be on PlayStation for a long time. I'm not surprised that the FTC got them to say, hey, well, what happens if it doesn't? Because that's just corporate planning. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not taking Microsoft's side in this. I would not be surprised or shocked at all if they just cut Sony out of a lot, if not all, Activision Blizzard content one day. So Activision Blizzard and Microsoft have agreed to terminate the deal if it's not done by the 18th of July. The judge said on Thursday that she isn't sure when she'll decide on preliminary injunction, but obviously she is mindful of that date. Guys, that's a ton of amazing information that came out. What is the most shocking piece that you saw? And what are you doing this weekend if you live in America and it's July 4th, you guys? I hope that you're having a wonderful day. Stay out of the heat and play more games, because games are awesome and you deserve awesome.